Hi, and welcome to another Whistle Stop Tour of Tanach episode today. I hope that we are live. Yes, I believe we are. Hello, sorry for the delay there. Welcome to another Whistle Stop Tour of Tanach, our next installment, where today we are on Shir number 9, our session number 9, on our 8th prophet, which is Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk is a really fascinating book. He's really not very well known. It's only 3 chapters long, 56 verses, and we once read Habakkuk as a haftarah, but only in the diaspora. We read it only as the second day of Shavuot. So that means in Israel they never read Habakkuk as a haftarah. So really, again, one of these Nevi'im that's really not very studied and not very well known. And Habakkuk is fascinating because he asks the age-old question about why the wicked prosper. This obviously is a massive topic. Tzaddik v'ra lo, why does the righteous suffer? Rasha v'tov lo, and why do the wicked prosper? Habakkuk talks more about why the wicked prosper, actually. And we're going to see he uses his position as a Navi to question God and how God allows evil to exist in the world. I want to point out this question is also raised in other parts of Tanach, such as Eov and places in Sefer Yirmiyahu in the book of Jeremiah, and Eov is the book of Job. I'm going to give you the answer that Habakkuk gives. I'm going to just look at how Habakkuk addresses it and how Habakkuk answers it. And it may not be an answer that suits everyone, but hopefully we'll get an important message for us today. So again, we're going to use our threefold approach to Habakkuk. Firstly, we'll look at the context, when did he live? Secondly, we'll look at the content, what does he talk about? And thirdly, we'll look at the concepts, the overall message to his generation and to ours today. I should also state before I go any further that, as always, the source sheet is available for downloading at the United Synagogue's website. You can find it. I think the link should be next to this video. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat option under the video. I will check at the end of the session. And also, as always, any feedback or questions can also be sent to me by email, learnwithpnina@gmail.com. And thank you so much for joining us, and let's see what we can get through today. So let's begin with the context. Habakkuk is yet another of these prophets where we're not really given very much information. There's no date, there's no location, there's no lineage. If I share my source sheet with you, you will see, just as I get it up, you'll see here the opening line of Habakkuk. You can see we don't even get sort of a hint to where he is or anything like we've had in the past. This is all we get. Source number 1, if you see, from the first, I'm just getting my spotlight here. Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 1, Hamasa asher chazah Habakkuk hanavi. This is the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet prophesied. There's really no background information at all. This is one of the prophets where we get the least information. And we see again that interesting word Hamasa that I think we talked about last week with Nachum, that Masa also means a burden. And I think in this case, it hints to the fact that this is going to be a really difficult, heavy, burdensome topic that Habakkuk's going to talk about. The question of why does evil exist in the world is not an easy, light discussion. So it's foreshadowing, it's preparing us for the difficulty of the topic that's coming. Now, Habakkuk, the name Habakkuk doesn't appear anywhere else in Tanach. It's a bit of a strange word. We're not really sure what it comes from. It's possible that it's linked to the Hebrew word chabek, meaning embrace, like chibuk is a cuddle or a hug in modern Hebrew. It's possible that it links to that, and we'll come back to that idea hopefully a bit later. What we do know about him is that Chazal say that he lived in the time of Menashe. This is the same, if you look in source number 2 here, this is the same Midrash from Seder Olam Rabbah that I shared with you last week, when we looked at Nachum, that said that Yoel, Nachum, and Habakkuk prophesied in the time of Manasseh, but Manasseh's name's not written because he was wicked. He didn't merit to have his name written down. So that would imply that Habakkuk also lives at the time of Manasseh. Now, we talked about Manasseh last week. Manasseh was during the time of the Assyrian Empire, remember, before the rise of the Babylonians. Now, this is really interesting. I think I have a source, I have a timeline here for you down here that you can look at. We'll come back to it again, but here's Manasseh. Okay, and I've put Habakkuk there with a question mark. We'll come to why. Why? Because Habakkuk is going to say his question about why does evil exist in the world is based on the Babylonians. He describes with the name Kastim, Chaldeans, which is another name for the Babylonians. He says, why does this evil empire of the Babylonians exist? So that leads people to say that Habakkuk had to be in the time of the Babylonians, which would put him later, maybe around this time period of, as I've put Habakkuk there with a question mark, during the rise of the Babylonians. Now, so this however, to be honest, I think it's not a problem to say that Habakkuk lives here during the power of the Assyrians, because he's a prophet. He can prophesy that the Babylonians are going to rise as a world power and that they're going to be evil. It's not a problem for us. We believe in prophecy. But again, there are those who want to say that actually he lived later. To be honest, I think that we could say that, again, he did both, okay? He began prophesying here in the time of Manasseh, but he continued to be a prophet into the time of Yoshiyahu, when Assyria fell and the Babylonians rose. I think that's, again, fine to put the two ideas together. Now, just to show you here in source number 3, what do I mean, and to sort of emphasize that idea that he probably did live earlier than the rise of the Babylonians. We see here as an example in source number 3, Habakkuk in chapter 1, he explains the shock of the nations of the world. Let's just read it in the English. We're reading Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 to 7. Look among the nations and observe well and be utterly astounded, for a work is being wrought in your days which you would not believe if it were told. Meaning the nations of the world are going to be shocked at the rise of the Babylonians, because they don't expect it to happen. For lo, I am raising up the Chaldeans, another name for the Babylonians, that fierce and impetuous nation who cross the earth's wide spaces to seize homes not their own. Meaning, the Navi himself says, look, the world are going to be shocked by this, implying that he is speaking in a time before the rise of the Babylonians. So again, I think it's not a problem to say that he lives here in the time of Manasseh, in the 7th century, mid-7th century or so, but it's possible that also he continues on to the time of Yoshiyahu, and we'll come back to that idea later and why that's relevant. There is one other idea. I should also tell you, as always, there's always a wealth of different opinions. The Radak here says that he actually thinks in source number 4, I'll just sort of the underlined bit at the end here, he writes, he says, actually, it appears to me that he's at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar, meaning the beginning of the rise of the Babylonians. Why? Meaning, because it talks about this happening in your days, meaning he's not talking about something that's happening in 50 years' time. Rather, he's talking about something that's happening in a year, in a few years' time. Okay, so Radak wants to say, no, actually, he's definitely later at the time of the rise of Nebuchadnezzar. One other opinion is in the Zohar, actually, so quite Kabbalistic here. The Zohar, the ancient work of Kabbalah, says that actually links Habakkuk to a story in Kings, the book of Kings, Sefer Malachim, where Elisha, the prophet, who was the student of Eliyahu, when Elisha brings, he tells a woman, a childless woman, you will have a child, and she does, and then her child her child actually dies, and Elisha brings that child back to life. When Elisha tells this woman, the Shunammite woman, that she will have a child in a year's time, the phrase he uses here is choveket ben. You will embrace a son. Here, I've put it in bold for you. And the Zohar says that there's a link between that word choveket and Habakkuk. Therefore, it's the same person. This is a bit difficult historically because it puts him sort of in the 9th century as opposed to in the 7th century, which Chazal also say he lived much later in the 7th century in the time of Menashe, and Elisha lived about 2 centuries earlier than that. So historically it's a bit difficult. Often these midrashim are coming to, or these ideas are to teach us a lesson. So let's try and think, and I'll return to this at the end. What's the lesson here that links Habakkuk to this sort of miraculous child that is brought back to life? But to summarize section part 1 of the context, I know I've given you a few different ideas, but essentially we can say, let's just go back to our timeline, that Habakkuk is most likely living here at the time of Menashe and possibly going on to very close to, you know, the new century at the end of the 7th century. That's his time period. So let's go on now to content. A second part of our session, content. What is he speaking about? So essentially, he's talking about the question of theodicy. Why evil is allowed to exist? I mean, using the example of the Babylonians, this evil empire Babylonians. And it's really split into 2 sections. We've got section A, which is chapters 1 and 2, where there's a dialogue with God, where Habakkuk asks the question and does receive an answer. And then section B is where Habakkuk sings a song of praise to God, praising him. So let's just talk about this in a bit more detail. Section A, we see that Habakkuk really uses quite harsh language. He's quite strong, and he's probably the harshest of the people in Tanach who question God on this topic. He does it very strongly. We have Abraham obviously questions God when he wants to destroy Sodom and Amorah. We see Moshe questioning God when he wants to destroy the people after the sin in the desert. Numerous people do this, but Habakkuk seems to use very strong language. Let's look as an example in source number 6. I've brought for you the opening verses from Habakkuk chapter 1. Ad ana Hashem shivati velo tishma. How long, God, will I cry out and you not listen? Already there, that's quite a brazen thing to say, that God's not listening to us. As akelecha chamas velo tashia. I'm crying out to you violence and you're not saving. Lama tir'ena aven va'amal tabit. Why are you making me see all these sins and bad things, v'shod v'chamas lenegdi, and plundering and violence before me? I don't want to see all these bad things in the world. V'hi rivu madon misa, and arguing and strife are before me. So he's saying, why are you allowing all these terrible things to happen? Al kain tafog Torah. Therefore, because of this, Torah will weaken in the world. V'lo yatsa lenetzach mishpat, and justice will never take place. Ki rasha machtir et tzadik, because the bad people are getting in the way and preventing the righteous people. Al kain yatsa mishpat me'ukal. Therefore, judgment and justice is crooked. It's twisted. It's not coming out right. We see it is a very strong word. And this phrase, Al kain tafog Torah, that I've bolded for you, he's saying this is going to cause people to lessen their Torah observance, because righteous people will see all the wicked that exists in the world and they'll say, well, if this is the case, what's the point in being righteous? What's the point in serving God and keeping the Torah? So it's going to turn people away from Torah. That's what Habakkuk is quite worried about here. We see that Habakkuk then continues to say that he describes the wickedness of the Babylonians and how terrible they are. And actually Rashi on that in the middle of chapter 1 says that here is when he quotes a Chazal, something from our sages that say this, that God regretted 3 things that he created in the world. One of them was the Babylonians, meaning that they were so wicked that God even regretted that he created them. Habakkuk ends the chapter saying God, there's no way that you would see this evil and allow it to continue. Therefore, you must not be watching. It's quite a brazen, strong accusation to make against God. It goes against our theology and our belief that God is constantly involved, constantly in watching and taking care of us. Habakkuk saying, clearly you're not watching, otherwise I don't understand how you'd allow this evil to exist. And the strength and the harshness of his accusation could be seen here. I'm going to share with you in source number 7 at the beginning of chapter 2. This is what he says. Let's just read it in the English. On my watch I will stand, and I will set myself a fortress. I will look at and see what he will speak to me, and I will reply when I am reproved. Here Habakkuk says, I'm going to stand here on my watch. I'm going to stay in this place, and I'm not going to move till I get an answer. Okay. It's quite an interesting... hopefully, some of you this might sound familiar actually. There's a story of Choni Hama'agel in the Gemara, in Tanach 23a, where in a time of a drought, it's quite a famous story. Choni says, he draws a circle on the ground. He says, I'm standing in a circle and I'm not moving, God, until you send rain. And God answers and he sends rain. And actually there in the Gemara, it says, how does Choni know to do this? And it quotes this pasuk from Habakkuk, saying he learned it from Habakkuk, the prophet. Habakkuk taught him that idea of saying, I'm not moving till I get an answer, God. And demanding. It's quite a brazen thing to do. I think you have to be quite righteous. I'm not suggesting that we should be doing that today, but they get away with it. We see, by the way, that Habakkuk is never rebuked for his strong language, for his accusations of God not caring and not being involved in the world. He never gets rebuked by God, which is quite significant. We'll come back to that in a bit later. Let's just carry on with this source here. What answer then does God give? He does give an answer. Here in verse 2, let's carry on in source number 7. And the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and explain it upon the tablets, so that one may read it swiftly. For there shall be another vision for the appointed time, and he shall speak of the end, and it shall not fail. Though it may tarry, wait for it shall surely come, it shall not delay. Meaning, write down, God tells Habakkuk to write down 2 dates, it sounds like, because we know there's 2 ideas that the redemption can come in 2 ways, in its time or hurried up based on our actions. And he tells him, write down two times. And he says, it will not fail, it will come. The redemption, the final Ge'ula, the Mashiach is going to come. And let's just read this in Hebrew, where I've highlighted it in gray. Im yitmamea chakelo. If it delays, wait for him. Ki yavo yavo lo yacher. Because it will surely come, it will not delay. Meaning, if it's taking time, don't worry. And this actually sounds very similar to one of the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam that we have turned into a song, where we say, Ani ma'amin, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Mashiach, and we use similar wording. It's similar wording to this wording. So essentially, God is saying you have to take a macro view of history. You have to have a long view. You can't just think about what you see here in this generation. There's a bigger picture, and we have to be patient because the end will come. There is light at the end of the tunnel. You have to be patient. And how does it end here? Behold, what do we need? But the righteous shall live by his faith. This final bit where I've bolded at the end of verse number 4 here, righteous should live in faith. And that's essentially what God is telling Habakkuk. You need to have faith. Now, we may say this isn't such a great answer. It's not so easy to internalize. The Abarbanel, someone who, the medieval commentator who lived through the Spanish expulsion and then the Portuguese expulsion, someone who had a very high position in court, who was even allowed to remain but chose to be exiled with the Jewish people. He says that we need to be patient. He interprets this line as saying we need patience. And if someone who lived through such suffering and saw such difficult things in his generation, such as the Spanish exile, then perhaps it's something we can aspire to understand, that we need to have patience too. We'll come back to this soon. So that's section A, the dialogue with God. Habakkuk questions quite harshly, God, how do you allow this evil? And God responds, have patience and have emunah. Then we see what happens next. Section B is the final chapter. Chapter 3 is this song of praise to God, where Habakkuk, it almost sounds like a a chapter of Tehillim, of Psalms. He uses beautiful poetic language to praise God. How does he begin? In source number 8, if you look here, Tfilah leChabakuk Hanavi al Shkinot. This is a prayer of Habakkuk on the Shkinot. Now, the word Shkinot is very hard to translate. Some want to say it's a musical instrument because he's going to accompany his song with an instrument. Actually, some people, there are commentators who say he must be from the tribe of Levi, because Leviim were the musicians in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. They sang and played the instruments to as part of the service, as part of the temple service of God. So some say he's from the tribe of the Leviim. But there's another opinion that I've quoted here for you in the Rashi in source number 9 on Habakkuk 3:1, where Rashi says, no, Habakkuk is begging for mercy for himself because he spoke rebelliously, meaning he has realized he was wrong, that he shouldn't have questioned God, and now he's apologizing in essence. And this is quite significant because we see that Habakkuk comes to a happy conclusion. He accepts the answers of God, which is significant. If it was good enough for Habakkuk, it's really something we can learn from too. So the whole chapter there is beautiful praise of God. I'll just show you the ending of it here in source number 10. Let's just read it in English, chapter 3, verse 18. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will jubilate with the Lord God in my salvation, God the Lord is my strength, and so on. He is really praising God. He wouldn't be able to say I rejoice in him at the beginning. At the beginning he says, God, you've clearly given up on us and you don't really care, you're not paying attention, you're allowing bad things to happen. By the end though, he has really changed his attitude and he's praising God, meaning that he totally has accepted. There is this full circle here. The fact that he is able to do that means that he's really accepted that there's a bigger picture going on, and that he knows he needs to have faith and just trust in God. So that's the content, okay? This dialogue with God, this questioning, and then an acceptance of God's answer. Now let's just move into our third part, where I want to let's stop the source sheet for a moment. We'll go back to the source sheet in a bit. So finally, I want to talk now in the third part about the concepts. What are the concepts that Habakkuk is teaching us? So firstly, obviously it's all to do with this question of why is evil allowed to happen? I think the first thing we can really take from Habakkuk is that he shows that we're allowed to question. Again, he's never rebuked by God for questioning, and even more than that, the fact that it's canonized and put into our Tanach shows that this is an understandable question. Every person alive goes through this question of faith at some point. How can God be a good God if he allows the wicked to exist in the world? And it's canonized in Tanach to show that that's an okay approach. Obviously, we hope that we don't live our whole life with that question. That's why the answers are there, to try and help us navigate it. But again, it's a valid question to ask. We see that the difference here for Habakkuk is it's quite a national question. He's not asking on a personal level, why does suffering exist? He's asking why a wicked nation is allowed to prosper that's going to do bad to other nations. So he's really asking on quite a national level. Let's ask a question for a moment. Why does Habakkuk ask this? So if we just go back to the original historical context that we've talked about, what maybe was Habakkuk seeing that, okay, we've talked about maybe he was witnessing or about to witness the rise of the Babylonians. What else might have actually been happening? Now, I want to share with you now a Midrash. Let's just go back to my source sheet. There's a Midrash here from, sorry, using a different computer, it's a bit slower. Okay, so here we see in source number 11, there is a Midrash here. Now, it's from Midrash Tehillim about Habakkuk, and it explains here, I'll really just explain it in my own words, but it's there on the source sheet for you to see where it comes from. There's an idea that Habakkuk saw with prophecy everything that was going to happen. Okay, he saw the destruction of the Babylonian destruction of the temple. He saw the Roman destruction of the temple, And he saw a few things. He saw two people in particular being thrown into fire. He saw Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael being thrown into the fiery furnace in Babylon and surviving. That's a story from the book of Daniel. And he also saw Rabbi Hanina ben Tardion being thrown into the fire. Now, Hanina ben Tardion is one of the 10 martyrs that we read about a number of times in the year, who were burnt to death by the Romans for not obeying their rule, their order to stop learning and stop teaching Torah. And this is what he says. I'm just going to read the underlined words here. Ribon kol ha'olam, elu tzadikim ve'elu tzadikim. Hashem, master of the universe, these ones are righteous. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they're righteous. And these ones are righteous. Hanina ben Tardion. Elu tzadikim ve'elu taharim. These ones are righteous and these ones are pure. Ve'elu kadoshim, and these ones are holy. Mipnei ma elu netzulim ve'elu nisrafim. Why are these ones saved and these ones burnt? That was his question. He said, I don't understand why these ones are saved, but these ones are burnt. They're both holy, they're both righteous, they're both good people. Now, it's interesting because the Midrash here is really putting into Habakkuk's words more of a question of why do the righteous suffer, which isn't seen as much in the text. In the text of the prophet, in the book of Habakkuk itself, he seems to ask more, why do the wicked prosper? They are obviously intertwined very much. We see he's saying, you know, this Midrash is saying that Habakkuk saw things that were going to happen that just didn't make sense to him, and this is what led him to question. But there's another idea. There's another idea that he was driven to ask these questions because of what happened to Yoshiyahu. Now, Yoshiyahu, Amelech, King Yoshiyahu, who we've talked about before, was a righteous king. Remember, he became the king at quite a young age. He reformed. He sparked religious reform, a Teshuvah movement. He wiped out the idolatry from Jerusalem, from the temple, and from the people, and he really brought people back to serve God. And people really had this powerful feeling, wow, good things are happening to us. He even took back land when the Assyrian Empire fell. He regained land that had been taken away by the Assyrians. So he was starting to restore the borders of the land of Israel. And people were really hoping, wow, things are good. Maybe we can even get back to the ideal times that we were in the times of David and Shlomo before the split in the kingdom. But what happens? A tragedy occurs and Yoshiyahu is killed in battle with the Egyptians in 609 in Megiddo. There is national despair, national disappointment, that all their hopes have been dashed. And it's possible that Habakkuk was writing in response to that the people felt, why was this allowed to happen? There was a huge religious crisis of faith, and when they saw that Yoshiyahu was killed by the Egyptians, and this really could have driven Habakkuk to ask these questions. Another thing that could have driven him to ask this question was also the rise of the empire, because when the Assyrians were really the first world power, this is an idea I had from Yael Ziegler, that the Assyrian Empire were really the first world power of this sort that invaded and conquered and took over other people. And when they fell, everyone thought, great, now we can just return to normal. But instead, what happened? Another evil empire arose, the Babylonians. And people were despaired by this. They said, why is yet another wicked nation prospering? How is this allowed to happen? So Yael Ziegler wants to understand that actually this is in the context, Habakkuk is asking these questions in the context of the rise of evil empire, something today that is just sort of understood, that there's always some sort of world power reigning, and they're not always necessarily the most righteous nation. We understand that, but back then it wasn't understood, and that also led to another crisis of faith. Why is God allowing this to happen? And again, that is a question that we can, obviously all these questions also apply in 2020. Why are these bad things happening, and why are wicked people prospering, and so on? What's the answer then? To finish, let's go to the main concept really that Habakkuk shares is how to answer this question. And how Habakkuk answers it is to have faith. Now, again, let me reiterate, this may not work for everyone. It's a very difficult topic, and it's hard to internalize, especially if someone is in the midst of the suffering, then it's incredibly difficult. All I am doing is sharing with you the words of Tanach as they are in the book of Habakkuk. Okay, there might be other answers that you can gain elsewhere. I'm just showing what Habakkuk says. Now, Habakkuk really emphasizes the importance of faith. How do we know this? In the Gemara, in Masechet Makot 24a, I shared this with you a few weeks ago when we looked at Micha. Do you remember there was a Gemara that talked about how the 613 mitzvot can be summarized or narrowed down to a few fundamental ideas? And we talked about that with Micha. Here in source number 12, I shared with you the next bit of the Gemara, which actually quotes Habakkuk and saying that Habakkuk, I'll just read where it's bold here. Ela ba Habakkuk v'hamidan al achat. But Habakkuk came and he summarized it all on the basis of one mitzvah, one idea. And what is that idea? Tzadik be'emunato yechyeh, that the righteous should live with their faith. Now, there in the Gemara, a lot of the commentators try and understand that this means we should keep the mitzvah every time we fulfill a commandment. We should have in mind that we're doing it to serve God and out of faith of God. That's taking it out of its context. We need to try and see, what does this faith mean within the context of the theodicy, of the question of evil being allowed to exist. And let's just finish off here really with the words of Yosef Albo, who lived in the 1400s in Spain, and he wrote Sefer HaKurim, the book of principles, where he talked about 3 fundamental principles of faith. And here is what some of his words about explaining Habakkuk. Let's just read it here in English, and with this we'll finish. The same idea is expressed in the statement that Habakkuk reduced the commandments to 1, as is said, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Habakkuk, having been complaining of the prosperity of the wicked and the sufferings of the righteous, lays down at the end the following principle, that if the righteous man will preserve in his faith, believing in the words of the prophets and in the promises God made to punish the wicked and reward the righteous, he will live without concerning himself about the vicissitudes of fortune, and will bear everything with good grace, and thus merit life in the future world. It may be hard to fully internalize, especially, as I said, when in the depths of suffering, but overall Habakkuk is telling us that the answer to the question of evil is to have faith that God will punish or reward accordingly in the end. We just have to be patient. We just have to have faith that the final redemption, that the day of reckoning, that the Geula, the redemption, will come at some point. We just have to be patient. Now, just to finish off, if we take a moment to consider words of people who have greatly suffered, maybe it can allow us to internalize, to accept this a bit more. And Viktor Frankl, the famous Holocaust survivor who wrote A Man's Search for Meaning, he said, "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how." And I think that really links to what Habakkuk is saying here. If you have a why, if you have emunah, faith in something, then you can bear anyhow. Then you can deal with the suffering and the wicked and the bad things that you're seeing in front of you. And I think that's the message of Habakkuk to his generation, to all subsequent generations, and for us today in 2020. Let's just summarize with our chart here at the end. When did Habakkuk live? It's not explicitly written, but possibly in the time of Menashe or Yoshiyahu in the 7th century BCE. The content is a debate on theodicy based on the rise of the Babylonians. God reassures Habakkuk that the good will triumph in the end, and he ends with a song of praise about God. And we see a question of why evil prospers. The concept, the question of why evil prospers is valid, but we should aspire to have faith that will all make sense in the end. And again, that all-important factor of living with faith in God, Tzadik be'emunato yechyeh, that is really the summary, the main point of Habakkuk. And again, just to end, to repeat that phrase from Viktor Frankl, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. I hope that I've given you food for thought. Again, it's not the easiest topic to be discussing on a Tuesday lunchtime, when it's about 34 degrees heat outside. Hopefully everyone's managing to stay cool. Just to finish off, I wanted to return to one more minute to return to the idea I mentioned earlier. I nearly forgot the idea about Habakkuk being that child who was brought back to life. Why is that relevant? Because what was the situation there? The Shunammite woman was childless. Her husband was old. She'd given up hope of ever having a child. Elisha said, "You will have a child." She had a child miraculously, showing you never give up hope. You never know what can happen. And then what happens though? That child dies, unfortunately. And she goes to Elisha. She says, "Why did you give me a child miraculously only to take him away from me again?" She sounds angry, she sounds upset, but we see that she still had hope that Elisha could help her. She actually locked the child in a room so no one would find him when she went to find Elisha, and lo and behold, Elisha was able to bring the child back to life. She still had hope. She realized the lesson that you should always have hope, we should always have faith that things will get better. And that's possibly the fact that the Zohar links Habakkuk to that child, is to show us again, to re-emphasize that idea that we should always have hope and we should always have faith. Thank you everyone for joining. I will quickly check to see if there are any questions. Let's see. Okay, thank you for the comments. I'm glad to see that people have enjoyed it. There are no questions. Again, if you have any questions, please do contact me, learnwithpnina@gmail.com, or feedback. I'm really happy to receive. Next week, please join us for Tefania, same time, 1 o'clock, Tuesday, here on Facebook Live. Thank you very much. Bye.